The Kimberley region of northwestern Australia. It's a gigantic sandstone plateau, 6 times the size of Tasmania. Slicing right through the very heart of it all is the vast gorge of the Prince Regent River. Because of the harshness of the land here, very few people have been through here, and some areas remain virtually unexplored. It's a trip that I've been looking forward to for a long time. Unfortunately for me, the only way I'm going to find Bush Tucker in the Kimberleys is by walking across the countryside. He'll be back in a couple of weeks to pick me up the other end of the Prince Regent Gorge here. At least he tells me he will. He's a mate of mine, so I hope he turns up. But before I go, I've got something very special to show you just behind these sand dunes here. This is it. This is a boab tree. And I guess if anything's the symbol of the Kimberley country, it's got to be this fella here. They dump these nuts throughout the year all over the ground. And they're pretty interesting bits of kit too. Just have a listen. That's the nut inside rattling around. When we analyse this stuff here, we find it's got a pretty high level of vitamin C, ascorbic acid. And then we found after 4 and 5 years, when we analysed nuts again that were that old, that it was still hanging around in pretty good quantities. So basically what you've got here is a food time capsule, and a pretty good one at that. This fella stands alone by itself. A bit grotesque and all the rest of it, but he also is pretty majestic, I reckon. I'll break this open and we'll have a look inside. There we go. Oh, it's a bit mouldy and mangy. That's what you've got. A little bit shriveled up, this fella, at the moment. You split him in half, and you can eat this white pith here. Tastes a bit like dry powdered milk, but it's not too bad. Well, I guess you could live off it. This particular tree is very important, historically. I'll show you on the other side. How about that? HMC Mermaid, 1820. That's 168 years ago. His Majesty's cutter. They put in here out in the bay, careening bay. They had to careen the boat, so they bunged it up there on the beach. I guess the sailors had a bit of spare time and put this in the tree. Funnily enough, the captain of the Mermaid, a bloke called King, reckoned that these trees were deformed by disease, and he had no idea that these nuts were a good source of food. And that was not an unusual mistake for those days. Hey, look at that. This is a little bit of bush tucker that's got its own bit of history here in Australia. Back in the days when the sailors back there on that baobab tree carved their name on the Mermaid there, this fella wouldn't have been growing here because he was only introduced from Argentina around about 1880. He's a bush passion fruit, passiflora. You pick him off like that when he's ripe and he's nice and gold like that. Split him open, and all those seeds there, you can eat them raw. Just like passion fruit. Good stuff. Birds like them, and that's why they're scattered all over northern Australia these days. They're very, very common, all over the place. Of course, King and his men on the Mermaid were charting only the coastline. The interior remained unknown until an explorer called George Gray came up this way, and he landed an expedition right here in this gully. He was attempting to travel overland from here in the Kimberley all the way down to the Swan River, where Perth now stands. With him, he had sheep and ponies and dogs and all sorts of stores. Like most of the whitefellas who came up here, they had no idea how to live off this land. They drove their stock over these barren-looking rocks, and yet there was a bit of a feed right beneath their feet. These are a little fella called mangrove snail. Well, I'll tell you what, Aboriginal people up here in the Kimberleys call them happy snails. They reckon once you eat them, they make you happy. Little characteristic about them is that they always crawl up out of the water. They're frightened of getting drowned, they tell me. You can boil them up and make a bit of an entree out of them. They're not bad either. Gray, despite his courage, was no bushman. He never did complete his journey, and he was lucky to escape with his life. I'm going to try much the same sort of route, not to the Swan River, but right into the heart of the Kimberley. But unlike Gray, who tried it in the middle of the wet season, I'm doing it without the added problems of torrential rains, which makes this country virtually impassable. But even after all these years, there's still only one way to get up into the high country. That's not a climb that I'd like to do every day of the week. But the one thing it does do for me is separate me from the saltwater crocodiles. There's no crocodile going to follow me up here. But this high country up here does have its rewards. This has got to be one of the most spectacular sights that I've ever seen in Australia. I've flown around this area before, but I've never been up here on the high country, on the ground itself. And you look back over that basin there, the St George Basin, and I reckon you could fit half a dozen Sydney harbours in there. This whole area is just so mind-blowing at this hour of the day. It's tremendous. You know when you're here that you're the only person within hundreds and hundreds of miles. Back there, we've got all the gorges running off right back into the bowels of the Kimberleys. And one of those gorges, the Prince Regent, which is back over behind that knoll over there, goes right up into the country that I'm now going to go up into. This is absolutely superb to sit up here and look at all this country. Mind-blowing. As George Gray tried to force his way across this country, he kept a journal. In it, he described the area as being ruins of hills composed as they were of huge blocks of red sandstone, confusedly piled together in loose disorder. And I reckon that pretty well sums it up. Gray would have found it very hard going. I don't envy him one little bit. Particularly as he would have had no choice but to go up and down the gullies and the small valleys that crisscross the Kimberley. In these he would have found the rocks giving way to areas of lush vegetation. And if he'd known what he was looking for, a few surprises. There we go. That's what I'm after. Those tiny little fruit there. Those tiny little fruit are now world famous. I'll tell you how it happened. About 8 or 10 years ago, I was showing these things and we sent them in, had them analysed, and we found that the vitamin C level in one of those little fruits is about the same as eating 10 or 12 oranges. So they now lead the world in ascorbic acid. Again, it's a terminalia, and there are about 3 or 4 different types around northern Australia that produce this sort of fruit. Of course, that ascorbic acid is very good for coughs and colds and things like that. And if you look very closely on these branches, you'll find some little tiny green ants, and they're growing just over here. Anyone who's walked around northern Australia would have encountered these fellas in the bush sooner or later. I can just get my feet sorted out. Here they are up here, swarming all over this nest, which is built up of the leaves and things like that. Because I'm coming near it, they're getting very, very active. And pretty shortly, if I hang around too long, they'll start to attack me. I think the first white people that I know of that they attacked in Australia was Gray's men when they put ashore up at Hanover Bay. You can see them walking all over the place now, and they've got 2 little nippers on the front that lock in and bite you. Aboriginal people found a use for these fellas. They'd open up the nest, break it open like that, pull out the larvae of the young ants inside, mash it up and chew it. I'm not about to do that because these fellas get terribly, terribly agitated. You can see them all sitting there, standing up on their back legs, ready to attack me as soon as I go near it. But the one thing you can do to them, one at a time, just grab that little fella there, just grab him and bite off the abdomens. And they've got a very sharp, lemony, limey sort of tang. Not a bad thing for a taste. See this tall, skinny-looking turnout here? There's a thing called Terminalia grandiflora. And I only discovered him about 4 or 5 years ago up at Columbaroo. He drops these nuts, not now because it's out of season, but you can still find them scattered around on the ground. And I reckon that this thing here produces the best bush tucker I've ever had. He hasn't got a common name, so I can't give him to you. I refer to him as the Columbaroo almond. He's tremendous. I'll just get some rocks and crack him open. No good. Rotten. Try again. These things are pretty hard to crack open. But they're really worthwhile if you can get into them. There we go. You see that little tiny almond there? Very, very small. But it is absolutely overpowering in taste. Tremendous stuff. One of my favourites. I reckon if you could cultivate these things up and put them in a packet and sell them in a shop, you do pretty well out of them. They're really good. As well as food and water, you've also got to have shelter to survive in the bush. In this part of the world, that's not a problem at all. Small caves and rocky overhangs litter the countryside and make perfect overnight camps. But if you think you're the first person to pick a spot, then you're probably a few thousand years too late. Look at that. That's not natural. That's been put there. All those grooves have been cut in there. Probably, I'd say, by this sharp-edged rock here. They'd work it up and down, establish the groove, and then use that groove to sharpen up spear points and things like that. It's an excellent rock surface for doing that sort of thing, because it's pure sandstone. Pretty interesting stuff. Hey, down here, what have we got? That's a baler shell. It's obviously been brought up from the coast and probably used for carrying water or something like that. Obviously the Aboriginals did the same trip and journey that I'm doing at the moment. It's had a bit of a break at one stage and they've fixed it up using beeswax or spinifex resin or something like that to stop it leaking. I'll leave him back here. This country's looking its best right at the moment, but the rains are over. And pretty soon, it'll start to dry right out. In a couple of months' time, you'll be hard-pressed to get a feed out of it. Even in the good times, you can't just go around picking tucker off any old bush or tree. You've got to know what you're doing. A lot of the plants are very poisonous and require careful treatment before you eat them. Get it wrong, and you'll end up as bush tucker for the ants. There's a little baby pandanus growing here. Little spiral-shaped fella. That's why they call him the screw palm. I guess one day he'll grow up to be like his mother here. But that's not really what I'm interested in. What I'm after is this vine you can see curling its way around the trunk and coming all the way down to the ground. Because it's about to die off. And that thing under the ground is what we call a yam. What I've got to do is clear this ground back because I can find the stem of the vine, and that's it there, running down into the ground there somewhere. So I'll clear all this back and then we'll start to dig him out. There we go. That tuber should be under there, probably about, maybe that far. I'm going to have to be very careful while I'm digging because if I break it off, I could have trouble tracing the tuber under the deck. That's planted right in amongst the root system here. Ooh, there we go. Oh, that's only a little one. That's probably one of the juveniles from around the area here. They're what you call a cheeky yam. It's pretty small, that one. I think we can do better than that. But they're what you call a cheeky yam. And what that means is that when you eat it without cooking it, it burns the inside of your mouth. So the only way to cook it is to roast it or perhaps boil it the same you would a potato. All this yam digging and that sort of thing is regarded in Aboriginal society as basically women's work. I was out the bush one time with an old fella and we found a yam vine just like this. I said to him, hey, what about we dig this one up? And he said, no, rubbish tucker, that one. Women's work. And walked away. We might do better down here. Ooh. There we go. Stabbed him with a machete, broken in two now. Bit of a dirty looking one too. There it is. You can see that bit of a potato looking thing there. That's what you cook up on the fire or boil it up in the pot and then eat him just like a potato. If I were to dig down there a bit further, I'd probably get half a dozen more of these. Just leave him there for a minute. Just over here, I saw a minute ago something which is rather interesting. Hasn't got that much fruit on him at the moment. In fact, there's one berry sitting there just on its lonesome. This is a thing we call dog's nut. And you can pick him off just like that and chew him up. Tastes a bit like apple strudel. But the really interesting thing about this plant is that it's one of the few examples that I know of where pioneers in Northern Australia actually use some of the local natural products. Oh, there's another berry there. I'll eat that too while I'm at it. Because this fella here is a bush medicine. And back in the days before they had cupboards full of aspirin and all that sort of thing, they'd dig up the roots of this fella here, boil it up, sip it, and that'd cure their coughs and colds and things. And I guess I've had 2 or 3, maybe a couple more old people in this part of the world tell me about this plant, white fellas. So it obviously worked. Well, they reckon it did anyway. I've never had to use it yet. Maybe one day. As you move deeper into the Kimberley, the sense of isolation grows. So few people have ever come here that the very solitude has preserved the whole area. These paintings over here, they're a painting style that's called the Wandjina, and they're very common right throughout the Kimberleys. After Gray had been moving through this country for about 3 months, he found himself at this cave here. And in his journal, which I've got here, he reproduced a lot of the paintings that he saw inside the cave, including that lot up there at the end wall there. Even when Gray was here, they were very old. And I guess today they're showing the signs of wear and starting to fade quite a lot. The knowledge that the Aboriginals once held about this land is also fading away. When Gray came through here, small tribes were scattered across the country. Now it's virtually uninhabited, and many of the secrets of the bush are probably lost forever. After about 3 months battling his way across the country, Gray gave up and returned back to the coast. He'd travelled only about 60 miles as the crow flies from where he'd started. But it was the lessons learnt from those old explorers that, with the aids of modern technology and maps, have enabled me to do in days what took him months. Mind you, there are times when the absence of technology can be a real joy, particularly when I'm up here on the plateau and the crocodiles are still down below. Most of the creeks and the streams around this part of the plateau take you back to one place, the gorge. And after all this walking through the bush, it's not until you come out here to King's Cascades on the Prince Regent River that the magnitude of the country really hits you. For me, it's nearly the end of the trip, but it's not going to be the last. There's so much to explore here, so much to find. I haven't even seen half of it yet. This is the real country of the Dreamtime, a place which is ruled by the sun and the wind and the rain, and certainly not by us. And it all makes you feel pretty insignificant. Well, this is it. Almost to the very top of Prince Regent Gorge. And this is the spot where my mate with his helicopter is going to pick me up. I hope he is anyway. There's a little lure, barra lure, that I knocked up from a bit of driftwood way back on the coast at Careening Bay. I reckon while I'm waiting for him, I'll give it a try out and see if it works. Might catch myself a barramundi.